All right. Well, welcome, Steve Reif, to the show today. We're so excited to have you on. The reason that we wanted to have this conversation with you is because the number one concern or question that we get from families, either when they've gone through a transaction or they've accumulated a certain level of wealth, is they're concerned about their kids. How does money and wealth, how does that change the relationship? And it can be across all stages. So when they're young, teenagers, and onto adulthood, and then even grandkids. So we're really excited about this conversation because I think most people interact or hear stories about how it's gone wrong. And we wanted to bring you on because from our perspective, we've seen it gone really well with your family and with your kids. So we're excited to really find out exactly how you did it. And we think that our listeners will benefit from that as well. So thank you so much for being here. And I guess we'll just kick this off by just saying, hey, can you just tell our listeners a little bit about who you are, your background, and about your family?
Sure. Yeah, you bet. And first, thank you for thinking about me and having me on. This is a real pleasure. I've known Stephen for many years and such a quality guy, and I've known Matt by reputation through my own son. So this is really fun for me to be here. So thank you first for that. Yeah, as far as my background, and I'll start with my immediate family. I'm married to wife Lori, and I have three kids: Katie, Stephen, and Anna. I grew up in Spokane, Washington. I went away to college to Texas Christian University for my undergraduate. And then I immediately went to graduate school for my MBA from Wharton School. It was a little bit unusual that I didn't have a gap in there. And then after that, I quickly moved back I actually interviewed on the West Coast. I wanted to get back to the West Coast because that's where I grew up and closer to family, and ended up picking a job in Portland. I could have gone to Seattle, Portland, or LA, and I chose Portland just because I liked the position better. And at the time, I was looking to get into management consulting. And back then in Portland, the best way to do that was through consulting arm of what was then a Big Eight accounting firm. This is going to date me here. So it's now Big Four accounting firms. But and so that's what I did. I was in a consulting group of about a dozen headcount with one of the Big Eight accounting firms in Portland. And so that's where I got my start. Just from a professional standpoint, they had a really strong healthcare practice and a strong banking practice. And there's another young guy that came about a year after I did. His name is Phil. And he and I both had this entrepreneurial bent behind us. And so we were bouncing off ideas that might or might not work. But the genesis of the business that Phil and I started was that a couple years later, this new product, Lotus 123, came out, and it had some very rudimentary programming capabilities. And that was the beginning of our company, which was basically in the space of budgeting and planning applications for businesses and larger businesses like hospitals and banks. And it turned out other verticals that we chose. We ran the business. We ended up adding a third partner later on. Grew all internally, all kind of organically from a very slow start. I mean, I think our revenue growth rate turned out to be 30% a year, but we started at $30,000 was our first year. So it takes a while to get up to anything of substance.
Yeah.
And so long story short, about 18 years in, we entertained some equity investment, and I probably wasn't ready for it yet, but one of my partners was very ready, and the other one was a little ambivalent. We sold the majority stake. We retained the minority stake. So we knew we were giving up control at that point, and they brought in their own CEO. But we still had a significant minority stake looking forward to, a strategic exit at some point. And that came on a little sooner than we thought. It was actually about 3 years in. The private equity firm decided, because we had a say, but not really much of a say, to do a strategic exit at that point. A company called Business Objects bought our company. And so anyway, that was it. And I stayed on for another 18 months and then left after that. But the weird thing is at age 47 or whatever I was done. And it was a very weird thing for me to be done that early.
Well, I was actually just going to follow up, Steve, on a point you finished on, which is transitioning away from working full time to not working full time. And so my question was going to be, what you did after the sale in terms of how you spent your time and what you found yourself doing. Did you struggle with that? Because we hear that sometimes from clients about how that can be a hard transition.
Yeah, a huge struggle, much more than I ever thought. I do think my identity was wrapped up in being an entrepreneur and working hard. And I don't know what came first, but I really had kind of struggled with some insomnia. And I think it was leading up, I think it was just kind of a cumulative stress going through a sale. And this was all self induced. I'm not blaming anything outside, but I do think I was really stressed. Is this the right time? Is this the right circumstance to get out? My partners were really pushing for it. I wasn't. So there was a lot of internal angst about, did I do the right thing? And then other questions would come to mind, like, is this enough? I'm 47. I got to get to, maybe 87 and beyond kind of thing. And it's like, is this going to be enough? And then the other thing was, and I think this was more of a satanic thing or demonic thing, is just like, what am I good for now? I mean, I had this expertise. I'm no longer using that expertise. And it just felt like, okay, what am I good for? And I found myself at home. I mean, Stephen, you might appreciate this, but it was a season when the older child was already out of the house and in college. And my second one was heading off to college. And the third was like in 8th grade, 9th grade. And I found myself home with a dog, a new dog, doing laundry and doing dishes and cooking. And it's like, is this what my life has ended up being? And which was totally awful because nobody told me that. Nobody was demanding that I do any of that. But I do think there was this I guess you'd call it an identity crisis on what, and then I was stressed out about money, even though, no rational outside thinker would think I should have been stressed out by that. Part of it was I was going at 100 miles an hour and I went to 0 miles per hour. And I think that's, especially at that age, was not the right thing. So I advise people to try to do a gentle glide slope when they're even my age now, when most of my friends are retiring or getting close to it. Try, if you can find a gentle off ramp, that's better than just doing cold turkey. At least for me and for I think men in particular, losing your purpose is something that's pretty dramatic. I just talked to a friend who's in his 70s who just retired. I asked him how retirement's going, and he said, well, is it easy for anyone? Because even for him, he's in his mid 70s, actually, I think your purpose and your identity is tied up in what you did for your whole life. And so it was hard. It was difficult, actually, for me. It took me quite a few. And then it kind of led into some insomnia and even, I would say, depressive stuff for a number of years. The insomnia was what was hardest to deal with. But by God's grace, I kind of got out of that.
No, that's great. And I think we might have to have you back, Steve, just talking about the post I guess, transaction and all the things that come with that of identity and then finding purpose and meaning in your life. But I wanted to kind of transition and talk about parenting and how that has progressed kind of in line with the transaction. And can you just tell me how did you communicate it when your kids were young, or or could you tell us how old were your kids when the transaction happened? And because one day dad's going to work and then the next day dad's not. And, what does that look like? And how is that talked about in your household?
Yeah. I mean, I think they were well aware that I was thinking of selling the business or was going through a process. So I don't think any of that was a surprise to them, or nothing we kept hidden, except it had to be kind of kept within our household because of employees and stuff. I mean, and they were older, so it wasn't generational wealth. It came kind of late in their upraising. They were so busy with their own things. I'm not sure how aware of all of, how it was. I was thinking through this that, there were many lean years for us when, I was struggling. Did I do the right thing to start my own business? I had friends who were at the time working at Intel and Microsoft and on paper were already millionaires, and I was far from that. It was like just scraping by. It was not a steady stream of prosperity. Looking back, you might think, oh yeah, they had stuff early. We didn't really. It came later. Later, I guess, is in my 40s probably, was when they would have even noticed that there maybe was some wealth there that was beyond what maybe their friends were experiencing. And so I don't think it was a shock. And, like some of the things that they would have noticed maybe was a trip to Europe, and then maybe a new car or two, and then a new house. That was probably the biggest thing, was the new house, but that all happened prior to the transaction. I think we were trying to just, again, just communicate, this is all God's. Everything we have is His. As I was preparing for this, I talked to Lori, and to actually, Katie's here right now with us. So I asked her what her thoughts were about this interesting idea of how did the kids become not affected by this change in wealth. And I think it's because our life didn't change that much. Like, what was important to us was, our faith and our community and our friends and the school the kids went to, which, Stephen, you were a part of all of that growing up. And so there was really no change when the big event happened, as far as what we did or how we, talked about it, really, to speak of. We didn't communicate just a ton about the details. Even now, we don't talk, just absolute dollar details. I'm starting to now, just from an estate planning, and if I got hit by a truck or something, then I want kids to be a bit more aware of what some of the moving parts are. But so, yeah.
You said maybe we kept things kind of steady state in the way that we were parenting. I guess my question is, what were you doing already?
I would have to give Lori a lot of credit, and not the guy that went off to work every day. I think Lori was with the kids far more than I, and she was very intentional about talking to them about things. She did a lot of instruction, every day, and we did the normal things, the chore charts, the allowances. We talked about, giving and saving at an early age. So if we gave them $1, 10 cents went into this bucket and 10 cents went into the other bucket. And then the extra 80 was what they could do with it. I would also say, if there's one punchline of this whole topic, is prayer, because I would really have to say that, her intercessory prayer towards our kids was a huge component of this. I also would say we did try to model generosity. There were a number of things we did to do that. We wouldn't necessarily talk about how much we gave, but we would maybe talk about where we were giving. The other thing that I think they saw that might have been a little different than other families are exposed to is we had a lot of elderly family that the kids were around. Stephen, you might remember, but we had a grandmother, Lori's grandmother, living with us. So it's our kids' great grandmother for like 7 or 8 years. And so just, seeing that we were focusing time and attention. And then there were other great grandparents that were around, that kids were around a lot and exposed to. And I do think there's this other orientation that we tried to actually model and involve the kids in. I do think we modeled hard work. I mean, I think the kids saw that I worked hard and was pretty focused on that. I talked to Katie. She said, yeah, you did talk about it quite a bit at the dinner table, and so I do think they early on picked up that entrepreneurial bug a little bit. There's one funny story, and this gets to maybe a little bit of the culture in our home, but we used to come to Black Butte every summer, but we would start out giving them, we decided, let's just give them all of their allowance money at the beginning of the week and tell them they had to make it last all week long. And so, I don't know, maybe it was back in the day, $10 a kid. And 2 of the kids burned through their money at the general store on candy in about 2 days. The third kid didn't. And the third kid was the person who charged usurious rates of interest in the terms of, you got to share whatever candy you buy back with me. And so he would loan them some money, but he'd get half of the goods on the way back. He took advantage of his sisters towards the end of end of the week. There were some tears involved and all that stuff. So that was pretty, looking back, very funny at the time. It maybe not have been so funny. And then here's another entrepreneurial thing that happened is, back in the day, Disney Channel was pretty expensive to add it on to your home network. So Steven said, I will pay for that Disney Channel, but I'm going to charge my sisters and my neighbors to watch it. And so we'd have neighbor kids coming over, watching it, and charging Katie and Anna to watch it. So very entrepreneurial to help cover the cost of it. It was that was one thing he did, not for a very long time, because I think at some point he couldn't even, he couldn't cover the costs. So,
Yeah.
and we weren't, or maybe we supported it for, I can't remember, but that was some entrepreneurial things that came up. And then we have a pumpkin patch on our property at home, and I started this pumpkin patch. Partly it was mercenary reasons. In Oregon, they have this thing called a farm deferral. If you plant stuff on this land, then you pay a much lower property tax rate. So I started very early doing that. And the kids started helping very early. And Katie mentioned to me that that was fairly formative. They worked hard, but they also had some reward from it, from money that they could then spend on other things. So those are things that come to mind on what we did. I don't, I think it's by the grace of God. A lot of this happened, and so I can't say that we did it perfectly, but those were some things that may have been formative to them as they were growing up.
So, Steve, you were just saying that there was one, I guess, idea that you and Lori did for your kids to kind of encourage generosity. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
One idea we had, it happened, I think we started when the kids were either high school or college years, is for Christmas, we gave them a certificate that had a certain amount of money that they would choose who the recipient of it was, the charitable organization. They got to decide where to give the money. It wasn't a huge amount per kid. It was like $1,000 or something like that per kid. I think it did give them some agency and made them really think about, okay, who would I like to give to and why would I like to give to them? And that felt like a pretty effective strategy for us, and we're glad we did that. Kind of got them into the habit of doing their own giving as the years went on.
From what you said, the way that you guys modeled faith, generosity, hard work, other orientation, I think just has a great impact on your kids and even beyond that. I mean, I can certainly attest that an hour spent in the pumpkin patch quickly taught me that I don't want to be doing this for the rest of my life. So I better figure something out.
Exactly.
I think it's pretty clear a lot of things, like you said, by God's grace, have gone really well, and your kids are doing really well from everything we've seen and heard. But one question, I guess, just looking back now on the path and how things unfolded, if you could go back, is there anything that comes to mind, whether it's a conversation that you had or a situation that unfolded a certain way that you would do differently or handle differently than you did at the time?
The kids haven't said much to us about, Dad, we wished you would have done this, or Mom, we wished you would have done this differently. And I don't have a lot of regret about how we did things. I do remember one of my kids wished I had involved them more in the business, as they were growing up, especially probably junior high and high school, just to be a bit more aware of what was happening. And I do regret that. I think maybe my reasons were nepotism. I didn't want, the other employees to figure I was favoring somebody, or I had two other partners. And so I was reserved from that standpoint. I don't think I needed to be. I think maybe at this stage I should have shared more with them about, specifics. I do think one caveat, though, is I don't want their future to be affected by what they think they might get someday. We made I'd say a modest gift for a first house kind of thing. And that's really the biggest, that's all we've done so far, besides just, other, gifting for holidays or travel or something like that. And we at that point said, we're not sure there'll be any more than this, but we want you to, we want to help you with your first home. I actually do think that was mainly prudent because, they're getting something that helps them in the short term to get their first home. Yet there's no expectation that there's going to be a lot more later, whether we give it to charity or whether there's, some left over at the end or spend it all ourselves. We didn't really want that expectation. Wealth is fleeting too. You just don't know what's going to happen, right? And so that's one thing I think was wise for us to do. We've had other friends that may be in a different situation where they said, here's your money now, and there's not going to be any more, but it was maybe a lot more than what we did. And I think there's different ways to do that. I think it's all what you feel like is the right thing to do and how you feel like your kids will respond. Besides that, I think maybe I could at this stage in life communicate a little bit more so that they're more aware if something did happen to Lori or me or both of us together, that they'd be maybe a bit more prepared to figure things out. But the things they're most aware of is real estate holdings, and we do talk about a lot. Are we going to keep the family home? Are we going to someday do something different? And so there is some awareness of that. No huge regrets, I guess, Matt, from what I know right now. I'm sure that there are things that they might say, which I think it'd be good to get their voice in this, but I think I don't have a lot more than that.
When you guys were going through kind of the pivotal parenting years, were there any resources or maybe mentors or people that you felt really had an impact on you and your parenting, and just to kind of know the things that you guys implemented? Where did that come from?
Back in the day, Focus on the Family and James Dobson were kind of like, I mean, you probably grew up with that too. It was really key stuff. And I would have to say that I got most of that filtered through Lori, right? Because she was the one listening to all of the radio shows and getting some of the materials. So I have to give credit again to Lori for that. There's the one resource that comes to mind, Love and Logic, Parenting with Love and Logic. I think it's been reprinted. It's a wonderful book about just discipline in general and working with your kids. But I do think there was two authors of that and their names are escaping me, but it's called Parenting with Love and Logic, just a tremendous book. So if you can get an updated version of that, I would highly recommend it for any parent. That was pretty instrumental. Lori was really good at it because you're always coming up with a choice. You can choose to, I don't want to wear that, on the way to school in the morning, say, okay, well, but you could choose between this outfit and this outfit. What's your choice? So you're giving kids some ability to choose. They have agency, but they don't have control necessarily. So that was a great resource. As far as the money part, I think there's two things that came to mind, and these came maybe a little bit later. But there's Randy Alcorn's written some tremendous books on it. There's The Treasure Principle. It's a real short booklet. You guys familiar with it? That I think is great. And I think one of the things that sticks out to me is live for the line, not for the dot. He says, here's where your life is. It's this dot, but eternity is a line that goes on forever. So live for the line, not for the dot of what your lifespan is. Other things that come to mind that have come later, but the generous giving, I think, is a great resource for people that have either come into some wealth and or have had some wealth on just, how to steward that towards the end. They have a thing called the JOG, is Journey of Generosity, which is a weekend where you get away with other couples that might be in a similar situation. And that was really good for us. And I know that other people have gone through it, think it was valuable as well. And then, scripture comes to mind. There's a verse in Ecclesiastes, I think it's chapter 5. It says, and I'm going to mess this up, but it's God gives people wealth and he gives them the ability to enjoy it. And it says this person that is in that situation doesn't often think of the days of his life because God keeps him occupied with the gladness of his heart. And I think that's just a tremendous thing because especially at my age, when you're thinking, my runway is shorter than it used to be. I do think that it's God is the one that provides both the wealth and the ability to enjoy it, whether it's health or just the other things that come into your life. And so I do think God gives both of those things, and he does want us to have joy in our lives and just with gladness of heart. As I kind of like to think that, God's desire is for us to have that all the way up to the very end. And I think that's a blessing if God gives it. It does, it's difficult to see people that are my age or older that have wealth, but they're their bodies aren't holding up, or there's tragedies that happen. And I know that could happen, and God uses suffering in a lot of ways to grow us. But I think that passage in Ecclesiastes 5 was pretty good. And I just read this morning that's saying wealth is fleeting. You just can't count on it. So that you have to have more than that, that, God is our security. He's the one that is our foundation. So lots in the Bible besides our resource, but which you guys know.
I was just going to say, the last question I had was, you've just finished sharing lots of good words of wisdom. So just to follow up, anything else that you had thought of that you would share to yourself or as someone in your shoes, 10 or 20 years ago, what would you tell them?
Oh, yeah. I think my failure becoming anxious and kind of maybe just burnt out. I mean, cognitively, I was trusting in God, but there was something at my heart level that wasn't. I was still trying to control things. And so I think back then when I was having that angst after the sale, it's almost like, after you purchase a car, the buyer's regret or buyer's remorse or whatever. I think I had that to an extreme. And I do think that was really a God trusting thing. And so I would tell myself, that 20-year-old self, that God's in this. He's taking care of you as part, he will take care of you, whether you made the right decision or not. God is in this. He's going to take care of you and your family. And so that would be my message to my younger self, is that relax. You're putting way too much pressure on yourself. I'm the provider. You're not. I provided thus far. Do you trust me to provide the rest of the way? So that would be probably my counsel to my younger self.
That's great, Steve. We so enjoyed hosting you and having this conversation. This was an absolute thrill for myself. I know for Matt as well. So thank you so much for taking the time to come on here and share your knowledge and your experience.
You bet. It's so fun to see you guys. Glad things are going well for you all, and it's just a pleasure to see your smiling faces today.
Like our perspective about wealth? You can explore our approach at birchwoodcapital.com. We work closely with high net worth families to manage their wealth and create thoughtful, customized plans and strategies. The information in this podcast is for general, informational, and educational purposes only. It should not be relied upon for any investment, financial, or any other professional advice. The opinions expressed by the hosts and guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of any affiliated organizations. Investing in financial markets involves risk, including the loss of principal. Past performance is not indicative of future results. Consult with a qualified professional before making financial decisions. Thanks for listening.